this is something I think has really taken on increasing importance over the last several months, and that's inflationary pressures. So if you look at global data, for example, this is the Food and Ag Organization. They put out a food price index. They call it a food price index. It's really a commodity price index. And they express this in real and nominal terms. But I think the thing to really notice here is really over the past several months, this big uptick that we've seen globally in farm commodity prices that you're starting to see both in real and nominal terms, such that if you even compare back in time, it's been in inflation adjusted terms of 70s since this index was roughly that high. Of course, if we look here domestically and maybe pick one commodity like corn, now this is not inflation adjusted, but if you look at this, in a historical context, we're living in some pretty interesting times, aren't we? And I think for a group like this, where say corn, soybeans are a key input into the pork production process, those higher feed prices, what's that going to do to margins down the line? How do you help control those costs? How does that affect the inventory and the herd size out there? I think these are all going to be really important and interesting things to watch if we really remain at these levels. And I think you look back a few years ago, in 2012 and then in 2008, these were disruptive impacts that had repercussions for several years to come. And so this may well have the same kind of repercussions, for years to come for the industry as well. So I've already shown you versions of both of these, both a marginal cost index and a willingness to pay index. What I've done here though is make those relative to a more recent time period. So the start of March 2018. The other thing I've done is taken a rolling 3-month average so that these data aren't jumping around everywhere. But if you look at this marginal cost index, the reason I kind of plotted this is, during the meat packing plant shutdowns and all the things that were associated with that. But then, really since, over the course of this year, it seems like the data is suggesting marginal cost really increasing. And I think that's seems to probably be associated with some of the rises in feed prices that we've seen. If you look at what consumers are paying versus those commodity level, you also see some pretty remarkable price increases. So these are, this is the overall CPI, not just food. This is food and all other, consumer goods that consumers are facing. And these are year over year numbers. So the last data point from April that the Bureau of Labor Statistics put out, suggests about a 4%, annual rate of inflation that we're seeing at the moment. So, in some ways it's not crazy by historical standards if we compare back to the 1970s, but, even again, looking at this graph, we haven't seen these rates of inflation for, really quite some time, over a decade or so. So I think the question is this just a temporary blip, or will this go away? Well, and what's causing it? One thing that I think that's going on here is wages. So I'm showing you some data here just in food manufacturing, food retailing, and food service. And again, calculating kind of year over year changes in wages. This is food, grocery here, some pretty phenomenal rates of inflation, 10% increases year over year to get workers to work in a grocery store, but even in food manufacturing, 4 to 5% increases in food prices. The same even in food service, which is kind of interesting because of all the COVID shutdowns that we've had. Now, one thing you might think is, well, we're paying a lot more for workers, we must be drawing in a lot more labor. But in fact, we're not. In fact, in every one of these sectors, except for maybe retail grocery, actually, if you look at employment rates in these sectors, have actually fallen quite a bit over the last year. So what's going on? We're offering higher wages, but we're getting fewer workers. And the answer is there are lots of competing explanations. One is that with all the rollout we've seen in the stimulus checks and increase in unemployment benefits, that maybe some people don't feel like they need to work because they can sort of satisfy their daily needs without having to have a job. I think that's maybe part of the answer. Some people have argued that maybe workers are afraid because of COVID to get out and work. And so it's maybe a fear factor, or it could be things like not having childcare if schools are closed down, so unable to get out there and work. And then I think there's some people that have argued maybe it's just reallocation of labor from some sectors where there's high demand, low demand to areas where there's high demand. It's just going to take a while to work out with that. But the point is, either way, wages are rising despite the relatively low levels of employment in these sectors, and that's helping. That's also contributing to this inflationary trend. So, couple more comments on: is this just a short-term blip, or is there something going on? So first, maybe the positive side of that is to say, as we're hopefully coming here out of COVID, maybe it's just extra demand. People are spending more, they can get out of their houses, and that's extra demand in the system, and that's what's pulling up prices. And that just means maybe there's more money to be made out there. Another story could just be maybe there's just more money floating around. And so all that's happening is the value of each individual dollar is falling. And so that would be a more problematic issue we want to keep our eyes on out for the future. So this is the Federal Reserve. This is a calculation of the money supply, the amount of money that's out there. And you do see this really sharp rise in the money supply. So there's money sitting out there, and that is helping contribute perhaps to some of the inflation we've seen. The other thing I think that's happening is pretty remarkable, actually, is if you look at personal savings rates. So normally in a recession, you can see, go back to the Great Recession we had here, savings rates, remain low, but people don't normally add a lot of extra savings during the Great Recession. You normally draw down savings when things are bad. But look what's happening here in the recent months, really, kind of crazy in some ways. So people have, at least in aggregate, maybe not a lot of individual households, but in aggregate, people have a lot of money in savings. And so I think maybe again, back to the positive demand story, what's happening is people have money saved up, the economy is opening up, they can go out and spend, and that's pulling up prices at the moment. So it will be interesting to watch, but that's my reminder to myself to start wrapping up. The market is also seeming to suggest that higher rates of inflation are expected. So this is, again, from the Federal Reserve, but it's calculating the difference between inflation protected bonds versus regular bonds. And so that's sort of the market's expectation of whether there's going to be inflation on out to the future. This particular graph is 5 years, and you can see really strong, despite the real concerns about deflation. And we did have deflation during the early part of the pandemic, but really at the moment, the anticipation is for some more inflation, at least on out into the near future.